chapters 14 and 15. This is chapter 14, called Seasons of Secrets and Surprises. On the subject of Christmas, Mrs. Dowdle made herself clear. It was just another day as far as she was concerned, and she meant to do very little about it this year. On the other hand, her monarch stove hadn't cooled since Thanksgiving. Her kitchen was stacked to the ceiling with black walnut fudge, candied orange peel, Linzer tort, sugar cookies in shapes, Pfeffernuss gingerbread people, Spingerly, brandy snaps, heavenly hash, popcorn balls, glazed walnuts, and some 50 pounds of peanut brittle rolled out on a marble top from one of her front room tables. Also, she'd ordered a turkey from the IGA store. There in front of the IGA, the veterans of foreign wars were selling Christmas trees. Mrs. Dowdle was on hand when they opened for business. Several witnesses lingered to observe the rare sight of her shopping for anything. And several reported how she gave each and every tree a good shake to see how dry its needles were. Also, she badmouthed several. A new thing for the Christmas of 1958 was trees sprayed white. One of them was sprayed in pink that would have shamed Phyllis's bedroom walls. Witnesses reported that Mrs. Dowdle staggered backward in her gum boots when she came to the pink one. The only tree of any interest to her was a blue spruce 9 foot tall. She grabbed it by the neck, shook the 11 daylights out of it, and seemed to approve. But when she heard they wanted 2 1/4 for it, she erupted like Mount Vesuvius. "I only want one tree," she was heard to thunder, "not the whole grove." Everybody in town figured she could afford any tree on the lot with what she'd earned off her roadside stand in the time of the Kickapoo Princess. But it hurt Mrs. Dowdle's feelings to spend money. I'd heard her say many a time that she had short arms and long pockets. When Mr. Milton Grider asked her why she wouldn't settle for a tabletop tree in the 75-cent range, she said she wanted a big one to fill up a bay window, to light the way for his coming. And whether she meant the Christ child or somebody else, no witness knew. Ruth Ann thought she knew. We were seeing a little more of Ruth Ann these days. With the Christmas baking behind them, Mrs. Dowdle was shooing her home, sometimes her before dark. Mrs. Dowdle was full of secrets. But then Christmas is the season of secrets and surprises. It sure was around here. Ruth Ann was somewhat sulky. "Mrs. Dowdle says we better have our chimney swept, and we don't have a fireplace," Ruth Ann twitched, "and she's going to have a big tree to lit up in her bay window to show him the way. She's just trying to pull the wool over my eyes." Ruth Ann's grown-up front teeth were about halfway in now. She didn't whistle and spit so much when she talked. Mother was grooming her for a solo in the choir concert. "Why do you think Mrs. Dowdle's trying to pull the wool over your eyes?" Dad asked. Ruth Ann slumped. "She thinks I'm nothing but a little kid. I'm practically halfway through first grade and she don't even notice." "She doesn't even notice," Mother corrected. "You can say that again," Ruth Ann said. "She thinks I'm worried. He'll be looking for me in Terre Haute, not here." It was just the 4 of us at the table. Phyllis was upstairs writing a letter to either Elvis or Roscoe. "Who, honey?" Dad said. "You know who, Daddy. Santa, Ruth Ann spelled. Claus. The kitchen clock ticked loud in the silence. I hadn't believed since the first month of school. She drew up her small shoulders to shrug off Santa Claus. "Word gets around." Mother and Dad looked a little sorry. Ruth Ann had been the last Santa believer among us, and now... "But, honey, are you sure?" Dad said. "What about leaving sugar cookies for Santa's treat?" "Daddy, you ate the cookies." "What about the reindeer on the roof?" "Please, Daddy, how would they get up there?" "Honey, don't you want to hang your stocking on Christmas Eve?" It was Dad's last offer. Ruth Ann pondered. She pulled on more chins than she had. She really was a miniature Mrs. Dowdle. At least with her teeth coming in, she looked a little less like Mrs. Wilcox. "I hadn't thought about the stocking," she said, "but I'm not a baby anymore." She poked invisible specks up her nose. In many important ways, I'm practically 10. But Rachel was there in her lap. Without the doll buggy, Rachel never got out now. But she rarely missed a meal. Ruth Ann was holding her up so she could look one-eyed across the oilcloth and see everything. As it turned out, Mrs. Dowdle got her Christmas tree, and it didn't cost her a thin dime. It could have cost her life and me mine, but it was a free tree. Christmas was on a Thursday that year, and 2 Saturdays before it, I was doing some chores for Mrs. Dowdle. She could round you up, cut you out of the herd, and throw a harness on you before you knew it. She wasn't working Ruth Ann this Saturday because Ruth Ann was at church with Mother, rehearsing for the Christmas Eve choir concert. So was Phyllis. She had to be in the choir too and didn't like it, mainly because Ruth Ann had the solo. Anyway, it was the middle of Saturday morning, and I thought it was time for a break and maybe a slice of fruitcake. Mrs. Dowdle had baked a gross of them. We'd been working hard. She turned all the mattresses and aired the sheets and beat the rugs. I'd had a raft of stuff to bring down from the attic. We were busy as bird dogs. In fact, we were up to something. Instead of fruitcake, she said, "Go on out to the cob house and find the coil of rope and bring the biggest saw." I should have seen what was coming right there. When I came out of the cob house, she was on her back porch, dressed in her full outdoor gear: flap cap, hunting jacket, 2 wash dresses, and an apron over a pair of men's pants, cotton stockings over her sleeves, railroader's gloves, gum boots. She was everything but armed. "Where's your pa?" she inquired, gazing elsewhere. I told her Dad was working at the food distribution center. All the people we'd fed at Thanksgiving would be needing Christmas dinners. "Where's your car keys?" I stared up at her. Surely she didn't know how to drive a car. Except for Mrs. Wiedenbach, the only old woman in town who drove was Miss Flora Schelleberger. She had a 1942 Packard Clipper, and she was all over the road with it. "Above the visor on the driver's side," I said. "Well, we'll naturally have to take the car," she said, businesslike. "How else are we going to get to the timber for a tree? Woo boy, here comes Effie." Sure enough, here came Mrs. Wilcox across the yard in her usual rig: a Mackinaw jacket, veiled hat, carpet slippers, and today, yarn mittens. She always knows when I'm going anywhere. I'd have to chloroform her and tie her down to get away without her. "I'm just happy to be passing," Mrs. Wilcox sang out. She swerved off the road to open country. The 3 of us tramped across the yards to where the Pickle was parked. A little pale morning sun had cleared the frost off the windshield and the first light snow of the season. None of this seemed quite right. But when I'd thrown the rope and a big 2-handled crosscut saw into the trunk, they were both in the car already. Mrs. Wilcox was in the back. Mrs. Dowdle was on the front seat, but not behind the wheel. "I'll ride shotgun," she said when I opened the driver's side door. I couldn't see a moment ahead. She was hunkered down and staring straight out through the windshield. "You drive." "Mrs. Dowdle, I don't have a driver's license. I'm only..." "A license?" She could hardly believe her ears. "We're not going on Route 36. We're just going country roads." "But..." "And you're long enough in the leg," she observed. "You growed an 1.5 inches just here this fall." "An 5/8 inches, I muttered. "Well then, you'll reach the pedals easy." "But I don't know how to drive." But my knee was on the seat. My hand closed over the steering wheel. I thought it'd be another 4 long years before I could drive. 3.5 till a learner's permit. 42 months. I dreamed of the day, but it was a distant dream. "You watched your pa drive many a time," Mrs. Dowdle said. "If a man can drive a car, how much can there be to it?" "Woo boy," Mrs. Wilcox said softly from behind. I was behind the wheel now. One hand gripped it. The other reached up for the keys. My heart was pounding like pistons. I adjusted the rearview mirror. I knew where the key went. I knew where the starter was, and I knew you started in neutral. I hit the starter. In cold weather, the Pickle was usually bulky as a mule. It started right up and roared. I watched my hand go for the gear shift. I yanked it into gear. Maybe first gear. The Pickle howled in pain. I jammed a sneaker down on the clutch and tried again. The Pickle took a giant leap and died. "Hold her," Mrs. Dowdle called out from up against the glove box. "She's rearing." Mrs. Wilcox disappeared completely from the rearview mirror. My heart was in my mouth, but my sneaker was on the clutch. I hit the starter, eased into a gear. By chance, my sneaker found the gas. We moved. Mrs. Wilcox reappeared in the mirror with her hat on sideways. The first leap had nearly taken out the grape arbor, but now I tried to steer because we were aimed at the back porch. The steering on a 1950 Nash is loose as a goose, and the hood's as big as an aircraft carrier. But we lumbered around the arbor and along the side of the house. We were still on private property, but the street was right there at the end of the hood. "Find the brake," Mrs. Dowdle mentioned. There were two of them, the handbrake and the pedal that wasn't the clutch. I used both. We skidded to a stop. My head hit the steering wheel and honked the horn. "Go left," Mrs. Dowdle advised. "We don't want to drive through town." I gave it a little gas and we leaped out on the snowy slab like a jackrabbit. Did I look both ways? But nothing was coming. We surged along in giant jerks. Mrs. Wilcox was all over the back seat. Another gear. Where was it? I remembered about the clutch. We whined into second. I was right there at the crown of the road. If we'd met anything coming at us, I wouldn't be here to tell you about it. "Pick a side," Mrs. Dowdle said. I swerved to the ditch and back into the right lane. Mrs. Wilcox seemed to be holding on to the back door handle with both hands. Mrs. Dowdle rode shotgun with her knees wide and her boots planted. Open country unfolded ahead. I discovered third gear, and the whole day brightened. I went left when I was told, and I went right when I was told. Every turn took me on a big sweep across both lanes with the fender swooping out over the ditch. But we made it. I was breathing pretty even now, though my heart was still hammered. It was like the first day of my life. We edged up to 30 miles an hour. The fences flickered past. Cattle out in the field stood broadside to the sun. Smoke rose from farmhouse chimneys. I still wasn't thinking ahead. I couldn't chance it. But there for a while on that straight stretch, I wasn't a kid. I was 16. Since I couldn't see over the steering wheel, I had to see through it. Now a scary light bloomed ahead. A big bean truck was coming our way, taking more than his share. Mrs. Dowdle's shoulder came up, but she didn't say anything. "Woo," said Mrs. Wilcox, and I shot off the road to give the bean truck all the room there was. But it was shoulder, not ditch. We threw gravel and bounced hard, but I got swerved back and bumped up on the hardtop. Now there was timber on both sides. We were coming up on a bridge over Salt Creek. I had to line up the wheels with the boards of the bridge, and I made it onto one of them. We clattered across the deep timber. "Pull off where you see that track." I geared down for the turn. We made it between a pair of fence posts, but it was close. I listened for the sound of peeling chrome. It wasn't even a track after a while. It was just brush and snow in the ruts. When we were out of sight of the road, Mrs. Dowdle said, "Wheel around and pull up." I turned in a clearing and the engine coughed, lunged, and died. I was wringing wet and about as happy as I'd ever been. Mrs. Dowdle swung open the door and began to fight her way out. "Get the saw," she told me. Then she looked in the back seat, and you stay in that car, Effie. It's rough underfoot, and if you broke a leg, we'd have to shoot you. Through bare branches, we saw a stand of evergreens. I suppose Mrs. Dowdle knew exactly where they were. She tramped through the underbrush and over fallen logs. It was colder and quieter than the rest of outdoors. Winter birds watched us from high branches. Mrs. Dowdle stopped just to drink it all in. She always thought the town was too loud and crowded, but the two moons of her specs were already spotting for trees. She moved among them, looking over the long-needled pine and the blue spruce, overlooking the scrawny ones. The saw was heavy in my hand. She took her time, but then she said, "There it is." It was a tall blue spruce, taller than we could use, but we could cut it to the right length. She took one end of the saw and I took the other. In the last moment before we started, she listened to the silence, and then we began to saw. It was all I could do to keep up my end. She was like a buzzsaw herself. In no time at all, the tree began to topple, and she pushed the oozing trunk away. Between us, we began to drag it back to the pickle. Just at the edge of the clearing was about a 6-foot tree with a perfect cone shape. Will that one do for your folks? So we cut that one down too. Mrs. Wilcox was all eyes from the back seat. Between us, we got both trees roped to the roof of the car. I wasn't a lot of help with that part, but Mrs. Dowdle could reach halfway across the top. I thought we were done, but she said, "We'll need us some greens for wreaths." So back we trekked. She brought a folding knife. We worked further into the trees, looking for the right branches, full and feathery. She cut, I carried. Then she went too far. She pushed past one last fir tree, stopped dead, and staggered back. I almost walked up the back of her gum boots. There ahead of us, freshly laid sod, was a brand new house, a ranch style with an attached garage and picture window, and even a bird feeder. We were standing in somebody's backyard. Where in the Sam Hill did that place come from? She wondered. You rarely saw her astonished, but she was. We thought we'd been out in the middle of nowhere. I heard voices, a door, and the scrape of feet. She spun around and nearly knocked me flat. "Run for your life," she said, "and don't drop those greens." We plunged, skimming the undergrowth, clearing logs. She had the saw. Gunfire behind us would have come at no surprise. Neither would snarling dogs. I ran like a blind boy with my face in the feathery greens. To this day, the smell of fir and pine brings back that morning. At the car, it was all a blur. Somehow the trunk lid was down, and Mrs. Dowdle and I were in the front seat, fighting for breath. "Lay rubber," she said. "Where's the fire?" Mrs. Wilcox said. Then she vanished out of my rearview mirror because I found first gear with no trouble. The pickle rocketed down the track. I aimed between the fence posts and screeched out on the road on 2 wheels. Once again, if something had been coming, I wouldn't be telling this. We headed back the way we'd come, top-heavy with trees. I was working through the gears like a pro now, and Mrs. Dowdle was wiping up under her specs with a blue bandana. "Whoa, boy," she said, "busy, busy, busy," and rushed off my feet. "Not enough hours in the day. I'll die standing up like an old ox," Mrs. Wilcox said from behind. "Did you see anything of the Dempseys?" "Well, who in tarnation are the Dempseys?" Mrs. Dowdle asked. "Why, they's the folks who bought up that whole tract of land and put up a new house on it." My eyes were mostly on the road, but I noticed Mrs. Dowdle's fists clench on her knees. "Many thanks for sharing that news, Effie," she said in a dangerous voice, and we drove on back to town. I did. Chapter 15, The Gift. Since Christmas is also the season of miracles, we were back before we were missed. On the last lap, I got a little overconfident the way you do at 12. I needed more work on my steering and nearly took out Mrs. Dowdle's mailbox. But then we were creeping back past her house. I managed to park the pickle in its regular ruts. It lurched one last time, and the engine died. I put the keys back where they belong. Maybe Mother and Dad thought the tree that turned up in her front room was Mrs. Dowdle's payment for chores I had been doing for her. Maybe they thought that both that tree and the big one that filled Mrs. Dowdle's bay window had come from the VFW tree sale at the IGA. Maybe I let them think that. Mrs. Dowdle and Ruth Ann decorated for days. They gilded pine cones and strung enough popcorn for 2 trees. The first graders made paper chains at school, and Ruth Ann made extra. The tree in the bay to show him the way looked like Times Square with a strand after strand of fat bulb lights. There were no presents under Mrs. Dowdle's tree, though. She said she didn't give any because of inflation. There was a tree in every front window in town against the blue glow of television sets, and a wreath on every door. A full-sized beaver-board nativity scene, floodlit, appeared in the park uptown, where Gypsy Pigot's big top had stood last summer. Woody's Zephyr Oil filling station gave out inflatable plastic snowmen with every lube job. And night after night, the strains of heavenly hosts singing Alleluia welled out of our church as Mother rehearsed the concert choir. Actual heavenly hosts looking down on the town could have taken it for a toy village under a Christmas tree, complete with a train track and winking lights. A light dusting of snow on Christmas Eve was the final touch. The town bustled now with company coming, kids home from college, soldiers on leave. Company for Christmas. After a sketchy supper at our house, the bustle turned to panic. Mother said that the Christmas choir concert was her first opportunity to share Methodist music with what she called the larger community. She was worried sick that she didn't have all the bugs out of Ring Out Wild Bells. Then she couldn't find her pitch pipe. The Methodist women had made Christmas choir robes out of Army surplus sheeting. Phyllis said she looked like a Casper the Ghost in hers. She and Mother had given each other Tony home permanents, but this hadn't calmed them. Ruth Ann's choir robe was a mile too long. She kept tripping over it and stumbling into things. She was sure she had her solo down pat, but Mother wasn't. The house vibrated with women. They were in and out of every room. You couldn't hear yourself think, and the concert was still an hour off. Dad and I got our coats and went outside, but it was too cold on the porch. We went around back and sat in the Pickle to be out of the wind. Dad had on his old pea coat from the Navy over his robe with the velvet. He hadn't worn it since the prince's funeral. As soon as we were in the car, I knew it wasn't a good idea. There was a heavy evergreen smell and pine needles everywhere for some reason. We had a clear view of Mrs. Dowdall's house. Lights were on upstairs and down. The kitchen glowed like a blazing pumpkin with last-minute cooking. She'd sent Ruth Ann home way before dark, and she'd been seen down at the depot waiting for somebody off the train. She has a fine tree, Dad remarked, brushing pine needles off the Pickle's dashboard. To change the subject, I said, but there aren't any presents under it. She doesn't give gifts. One of Dad's hands resting on the steering wheel there in the dark. You sure about that? I thought I was. She mentioned inflation. Well, maybe she doesn't wait for Christmas. Have you had a gift from her already? You don't mean anything wrapped up with a ribbon, right? I said. No, Dad said. Nothing that small. I thought, but I couldn't get past the day she told me to drive the Pickle. That was a great day. Every night since, I dreamed myself back to it. In my dreams, I was behind the wheel, gearing down and double clutching, and there was never oncoming traffic, and I was always in the right gear. I drove with one elbow out the window in my dreams, and I was 16 and 6 foot tall, with shoulders out to here, and nobody but nobody was going to tie me up and pitch me in the creek. Let 'em try. Dad sat there giving me some time. You could see our breath. The glow from Mrs. Dowdall's tree spilled out of her bay across the white yard like a welcome mat. Dad, who's that tree lighting the way for? Mrs. Dowdall didn't mean the Christ child, did she? No, Dad said. The Christ child's been here all year long. A moment passed, pine-scented. Then who? Dad stirred and reached for the door handle. Somebody we're just about to meet, and he's due now. We'd better get in the house to make him welcome. I was stumped. To our house? Dad nodded. A visitor from afar. You mean like one of those 3 wise men? I was lost as usual. Not exactly, Dad said, but he'll probably be bearing a gift. We headed up to the house then. Dad's hand was on my shoulder, which I liked. And son, he said, when you get a minute, take that crosscut saw out of the Pickle's trunk and put it back in Mrs. Dowdall's cob house.